In Chapter 9 of Another City, Urban Life and Urban Spaces in the New American Republic, Upton argues that cemeteries in the 19th century were not simply neutral burial places. They were urban extensions of the city, where class, race, and religion shaped how and who were remembered. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, American cities were expanding rapidly. Factories, railroads, and immigration pushed populations higher than ever. With growth came problems: overcrowding, pollution, slums, and disease. Trinity Churchyard in New York held over 100,000 bodies, far beyond capacity. As Upton notes, skulls and bones of the dead were kicked about the street during the process of digging cellars for a row of houses. This shows how urbanization transformed cemeteries into contested real estate. Cemeteries were not sacred in a timeless sense. They were caught in the politics of land, health, and profit. As Ibram X. Kendi reminds us in How to Be an Anti-Racist, space is never neutral. Upton expands on this saying, American urban burial grounds at the end of the 18th century were heterogeneous places shaped by their status as public spaces, by contradictory ideas about disposal of the dead, and by socioeconomic stratification of burial practice. Urban space, whether housing or burial grounds, reflects systematic inequalities. Cemeteries are no exception. Cemeteries are not just neutral resting places. They carefully reflect the ideas of surrounding cities, connecting the worlds of the living and the dead. Over generations, society's perspective on cemeteries has shifted with the changing of societal norms and ideals. Once thought of as a place of disease and filth, cemeteries are now a place of remembrance. The architecture of cemeteries has developed through the use of gridding and landscapes. Cemeteries have established public and private spaces, ideals, and inequalities, and above all, change over time. The symbolization of how social class, religious beliefs, and race can shape the memory of the dead is demonstrated throughout 19th century burial grounds, thus turning mourning into an architectural practice that instills the dead with the same ideals as living. In places like New Orleans, burial was once deeply spiritual. African and Catholic traditions emphasized the ongoing presence of the dead, offering second burials and grave orientation toward the east symbolized respect. But by the 1820s to the 1830s, cemeteries shifted from sacred to planned, privatized spaces. In Philadelphia, burial grounds became family-owned lots, complete with fences and monuments. Upton describes them as extensions of the city grid, miniature neighborhoods of the dead. Jeffrey Smith calls this the paradox of rural cemeteries, marketed as democratic, parks like retreats, but in reality reinforcing inequality. The wealthy brought elaborate tombs, the poor were buried in waterlogged pits or had their graves reused. Cemeteries reveal sharp differences in how groups such as class, religion, and race were treated. Upton cites a 17th century English student. Monuments answerable to men's worth, state, and places have always been allowed, and stately sepulchres for base fellows have always been open to bitter jest. In other words, if you were wealthy, your grave was protected and honored. If you were poor, your body could be disturbed, mocked, or thrown away. In Catholic New Orleans, St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 excluded Protestants and later Black residents. Upton writes, Protestants, and later Blacks, were assigned separate spaces outside the consecrated boundaries. Even in death, racial and religious segregation persisted. The First African Baptist Church in Philadelphia was forced to relocate its cemetery multiple times due to foreclosures and health ordinances. Eventually, their land was sold for factories and housing, erasing Black memory. This anticipates Irene Cheng's point that systematic racism is built into architectural practice itself. She supports this by stating, Blacks were an abject race. The cemeteries were simple, contemplative, and calculating, and the aria were of great stature and brave, like superior beings born to command. This hierarchy is illustrated as the Black cemeteries were not regarded as highly compared to the primarily white cemeteries. Mario Gooden extends this. Architecture and space control not just bodies but also visibility. Black Death, whether in the 19th century cemeteries or in today's urban spaces, it is often erased or marginalized. In the case of the 19th century cemeteries, Black Death was often spatially segregated to the margins, outside consecrated Catholic grounds in New Orleans or in reused unmarked graves in Philadelphia. This was not just a matter of logistics. It was a deliberate spatial strategy that rendered Black Death less visible, less permanent, and therefore less legitimate in the civic landscape. The absence of permanent monuments or marked burial lots for Black communities meant that their histories were systematically erased from the architectural record of the city. In this sense, cemeteries became double-edged landscapes. They are designed to preserve memory, but their very structure often enforces selective memory, ensuring that certain lives are monumentalized while others are systematically obscured. Some reformers saw cemeteries as public goods. Rural cemeteries like Laurel Hill in Philadelphia or Mount Auburn in Boston were landscaped with winding paths, lakes, and gardens. Sarah Tarlow argues these garden cemeteries meditated between the living and the dead, offering beauty, reflection, and civic identity. But even here, inequality crept in. Fancy gravestones and ornate plots displayed wealth, much like mansions in the city. As Bell Hooks reminds us in her writings on Black vernacular cultural spaces, always carry hidden hierarchies. Who belongs, who is excluded, who voices, and memories are centered. Globally, we see similar patterns. Paris Père Lachaise reflected Enlightenment ideas of order. Kyoto's Higashima cemeteries wove death into the city grid. Cairo's City of the Dead became a lived-in neighborhood, blurring lines between sacred and civic space. In each case, cemeteries are extension of the city's social fabric. These issues are not just history. In the U.S. today, racial inequality in cemetery continues. Many historically black cemeteries, like those in Florida and Virginia, have been paved over for highways, malls, or development. White cemeteries often received perpetual care, while black burial grounds relied on families to maintain them. Current preservation movements like the African American Burial Grounds Network Act in 2020 show how memory and justice are still contested in space. This reflects Cheng's argument. Racism is not just a cultural bias, it is embedded in the structures of planning, zoning, and property law, even in cemeteries. To conclude, Dell Upton shows us that cemeteries in the 19th century America were mirrors of the city. They reflected the same tensions, wealth versus poverty, white versus black, Catholic versus Protestant. By looking at cemeteries as design landscapes, we see that mourning itself became an architectural practice. Who was honored, who was forgotten, and who was excluded tells us as much about society as the houses or streets of the city. Cemeteries may look peaceful, but they're deeply political spaces. They force us to confront how race, class, and religion shape memory, reminding us that the fight for justice extends beyond the graveyard.